Today we're diving into a really powerful case study. It's all about how nurses, people right on the front lines, are tackling one of the biggest threats in modern medicine, antibiotic resistance. We're going to see how their leadership and, some real on-the-ground investigation can completely reshape a top-down policy. Let's get into it.
To really get a sense of the stakes here, we have to start with this. Back in 2014, the UK's Prime Minister said this, and it sounds incredibly dramatic, right? The dark ages of medicine. But it perfectly captures this very real fear. The fear that we could lose our ability to treat even the most common infections. Things like routine surgery or chemotherapy could become life-threatening. That's the world everyone is desperately trying to prevent.
So here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off by understanding the bug at the center of all this. Then we'll look at the big national plan that was put in place to fight it. After that, we get to the core of the story, how a team of nurses basically became detectives, what their evidence uncovered, and the very real human side of all this. And finally, we'll see how their work created a much smarter way forward.
Okay, first things first. We need to get to know the specific enemy in this story, a group of bacteria called CPE.
So what exactly is CPE? Well, the E part, Enterobacteriaceae, these are actually really common bacteria, think E. coli, that usually just hang out in our gut, no big deal. The trouble starts when they learn a new trick. They start producing an enzyme called a carbapenemase. You can think of this enzyme as a superpowered shield. It literally breaks down our most powerful last-ditch antibiotics, the carbapenems. When that happens, any infection they cause, whether it's a UTI or something as serious as sepsis, becomes almost impossible to treat.
And this chart, this shows you exactly why everyone was so worried. Look at that trend. Using data from Public Health England, you can see a few cases here and there for a few years, and then, boom, it just takes off. This wasn't some far-off threat anymore. It was a very real, very clear danger that was already inside the hospitals.
So why was this happening? Well, it's a mix of things we're all probably pretty familiar with from our own practice, right? Antibiotics being given out for viruses, which they can't do anything about. Using these big, broad-spectrum drugs when a more targeted one would work. And of course, patients who stop their course of antibiotics early. Every single time one of these things happens, it's another opportunity for bacteria to learn, adapt, and build up their defenses.
Okay, so with cases shooting up like that, the government had to step in. This led to a huge national mandate, a set of rules meant to stop the spread in its tracks. But, as we're about to see, this big idea from the top ran into a massive wall when it came to actually putting it into practice in a hospital. The official plan came out as the Public Health England Toolkit, and on paper it makes a lot of sense. Find the bug, and then contain the bug. The guidance basically said, you need to screen every single patient who comes through the door, you need to isolate anyone who's positive or even just suspected of being positive, and then you layer on all the strict infection control protocols.
But there was one massive problem. Just think about it for a second. For any big hospital trust, screening every single admission is just a colossal undertaking. The price of the swabs, the lab processing, and especially the cost and availability of isolation rooms, it's astronomical. The reality was, for many hospitals, this universal screening idea was completely unaffordable. The mandate had just slammed into the reality of an NHS budget.
And this is where our story really takes a turn. Because faced with this unworkable national rule, the infection prevention and control nurses at the Royal Free London, well, they didn't just accept it. They started to question it. They decided they were going to become investigators themselves.
This slide just perfectly sums up the two different ways of thinking here. On one side, you've got this huge one-size-fits-all national mandate. And on the other, you have what these nurses wanted to do. Use actual evidence to create a smarter, targeted policy that actually works in the real world. It's a fantastic example of how innovation can be driven by clinical practice.
So how did they do it? Their tool was something called a point prevalence study, or PPS. It's basically a research method where you take a snapshot of an entire population, in this case, every single inpatient in the hospital, on one specific day. It gives you a really clear picture of the risk at that moment in time. So on January 29, 2014, a team of 10 infection control nurses went out and surveyed 551 patients to get their own data, their own intelligence.
And what they found, it was fascinating. Their investigation on the wards gave them hard evidence that just completely challenged the assumptions that the national screening policy was built on. The data they collected told a totally different story.
Okay, check this out. The most interesting thing here is that massive 80% slice of the pie.
The common wisdom, the big assumption, was that the risk was coming from patients who'd been in hospitals overseas. But the nurses' own data showed that was just a tiny, tiny part of the problem. A full 80% of their patients had zero prior healthcare risk factors, and another 18% had just been treated in another London hospital. The threat wasn't primarily coming from abroad, it was homegrown, it was local.
So if the risk wasn't really about a patient's travel history, then where was it? This chart gives us the answer. The risk wasn't spread out evenly across the hospital at all. It was clustered. It was concentrated in these specific high-dependency units, places like stroke, renal, and ICU. And that discovery, that was the real game changer. It meant they didn't have to screen everyone, everywhere. They could focus their resources, like a laser, on these specific hotspots.
And this is really the key takeaway from their entire investigation. By going out and gathering their own evidence, this nursing team proved that the big assumptions driving national policy just didn't hold up in their hospital. The real risk was local, and it was concentrated in very specific units.
Now, figuring all this out wasn't just about saving money or making things more efficient. It was about creating a better policy for individual patients, because these nurses knew better than anyone that behind every single one of those swabs, there's a person, and there is a very real human cost we have to think about.
So it makes you stop and ask the question, right? What does it actually mean for a patient to be told you are CPE positive? We're so often focused on the clinical side of things, but what is the actual patient experience of that?
The reality is, the consequences are huge, and they go way beyond the patient's chart. First off, the screening itself is invasive. If you get a positive result, there's no treatment to get rid of it. You are simply branded as an infection risk, pretty much indefinitely. That label triggers isolation, which we know can lead to depression and delirium, especially in our older patients. And critically, that label becomes a massive roadblock in their recovery. It can make it really hard for them to get a bed in a rehab facility or another care home. It's a label that can literally follow a person for years and affect their whole care pathway.
So, armed with their own data and a really clear understanding of the impact on patients, the nursing team put together a new, much more pragmatic strategy. Their investigation was over, but the work was really just beginning.
And here is the really elegant solution they landed on. First, instead of screening everybody, you focus your screening only on those high-risk units they found. Second, within those units, you screen everyone. That makes it so much clearer and easier for staff than trying to do complicated risk assessments on every patient. And third, and this is crucial, you repeat the study every year to see if anything's changed, which keeps the policy sharp and evidence-based.
This sentence just captures the core dilemma perfectly. Even with their smart, targeted approach, the number of positive cases you actually find through screening is still pretty low. But the alternative, doing nothing and risking a CPE outbreak on a ward full of vulnerable patients, well, that's just unthinkable. The cost of doing nothing is measured in human lives.
And that really brings us to this final urgent message from the team. This is not some academic exercise. The threat is happening right now, and patients are being affected today. We absolutely have to act, but we have to act smart, using the best possible evidence we can get our hands on.
So we'll end with a question for all of you. This whole story is just such a brilliant example of nurses not just providing care, but actively shaping it through research and critical thinking. It proves that the people who are closest to the patient are often the ones in the best position to find the real solutions. So the question for you is, how are you going to use your own curiosity, your clinical expertise, to challenge the assumptions you see and drive better care for your patients?